Our theme for April 13th through April 19th is check your patterns, not just your problems. Check your patterns, not just your problems. Okay? Today is Monday, April 13th, and we are here with episode number 41. It's not always them. Sometimes it's the pattern. Okay? So our focus today is just to help you to recognize repeated cycles in your life. Our goal is to shift your mindset from blame to awareness to accountability to growth. Okay? So we're going to shift our mindsets from blame to awareness to accountability to growth. Okay? So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening whenever you are tuning in. Welcome to Cup of Cocoa and Chat. Whether you're driving, getting your workout in, out running errands, or just cozying up with your favorite beverage, I am so glad you are here. This is the space where we sip, share, and move through life with intention, no matter where we are. So go ahead. If you got your coffee, your tea, your cocoa, or maybe just a moment to yourself, settle in and let's talk. Because today we're not just talking about what's happening in our lives. We're talking about what keeps happening. What keeps happening. Episode number 41 is not always them. Sometimes it's the pattern. All right? So, if it keeps happening, we have to ask why. If it keeps happening, we have to ask why. Now, let's go ahead and get into this conversation because this right here, this might be the part that makes you pause for a second, right? We're talking about patterns, not just what's happening, but what keeps happening. Because sometimes it's not random. Okay? So I'm going to say this gently, but I'm going to say it real. And we have talked about the hard truths before. Okay? So here's another hard truth. If it keeps happening, we have to ask why. Not who to blame, not who hurt us, not what they did, but why does this keep showing up in my life? And I know that that's not always easy to sit with because it shifts the focus from it keeps happening to it keeps happening to why it keeps showing up in my life, right? Here are some relatable examples. You ever notice this? The same type of situation, just a different person, same kind of stress, just a different day, same disappointment, just a different name attached to it. And you're sitting there like, why does this keep happening to me? But the real question might be, why does this keep coming back to me? Why does this keep coming back to me? And let me say this. This is not about blaming yourself. This is about becoming aware. Becoming aware. Okay? Because I've had moments too where I had to sit back and say, okay, wait a minute. This feels familiar to me. Just a different situation, but the feeling, the outcome, the same. Right? So let me define pattern for you. Okay? It's when life starts repeating something until we recognize it. Not to punish us, but to teach us. So instead of saying, why does this always happen to me? Maybe we need to start asking, what is this trying to show me? What is this trying to show me? Okay? I want you to think about this for a second. What's something in your life right now that feels a little too familiar? Could it be a situation? Maybe it's a feeling or a cycle. Okay? I don't want you to judge it. Just notice it. Just notice it. Because in the next part of this conversation, we're going to go a little deeper and start identifying some of the patterns we don't always talk about. Because awareness, that's where the change begins. So it starts with awareness. Okay? So now that we talked about what a pattern is, let's go a little deeper. Because the truth is, a lot of us are dealing with patterns. We just don't always recognize them. Not because we're not aware, but because sometimes we don't want to look too closely, right? For fear of what we will see. So let's gently take a look together at some common patterns we ignore. Pattern number 1, same type of relationships. Same type of relationships. Right? You ever notice how you keep meeting the same type of person? A different face, a different name, but the same experience. Same disappointment, same confusion, the same ending. The same ending. And sometimes we say, why do I keep attracting this? Why do I keep attracting this? Why do I keep attracting this? Why do I keep attracting the same type of people? But what we don't ask is, what am I allowing? What am I allowing that keeps attracting this, or keeps attracting these type of people? And let's be clear, this is not about blaming yourself. Again, I'm going to repeat this. It's not about blaming yourself. This is about recognizing what feels familiar to you. Because sometimes we don't choose what's healthy, we choose what's familiar. Right? Because it's a pattern. Because it is a pattern. So I want you to reflect on this. Have you ever found yourself saying, here we go again in a relationship? Here we go again. It's starting again, right? If that is you, then we need to look and maybe start changing the pattern of same type of relationships. We need to look into changing that. Okay? So let's talk about money for a second, which is pattern number 2. Overspending the money cycles. Okay? You ever notice how money comes in and somehow it just goes right back out? Right? You tell yourself, I'm going to do better this time, or I'm going to do better the next time, right? But then something pops up, or you justify a purchase, or you say, I deserve this, right? And before you know it, you're right back in the same place. That's what I call a cycle. Not because you don't know better, but because the habit hasn't changed yet. Because the habit hasn't changed yet. Remember, we talked about poor habits in episode number 39. Do a life check-in. What's working, what's not, right? We talked about poor habits. One of the things I mentioned in episode 39 is how I taught my grandson a lesson involving money and boundaries, right? To kind of work on those poor habits. So I ask, are you managing your money or reacting to it? Are you managing your money or reacting to it? If so, then you need to work on pattern number 2, overspending money cycles. So let's move into pattern number 3. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each pattern, but just to give you a glimpse into each pattern. And I'm not discussing all patterns, but I'm discussing the ones that I feel are important and a lot of people can resonate with. So if pattern 1 wasn't you, if pattern 2 wasn't you, Let's look at pattern 3. Starting but not finishing. Starting but not finishing. This one right here, whoo, child, I'm gonna tell you. Some starting things is easy. Starting things is easy, right? Finishing, that's where the discipline comes in, right? Because you get excited, you start strong, you're motivated, but somewhere along the way, you stop. You stop. And this right here, this hit home for me recently. I was having a conversation with my son. He is 40 now, right? And he said something to me that made me stop for a second. Like I was proud, right? I was I was saying to myself, sitting there listening to him, oh my God, he was listening to me. He was listening to me when I was talking or fussing or whatever, but he was listening to me, right? He reminded me of something I used to say to him when he was a teenager, right? I used to always say to him, you start things, but you don't always finish them, right? Let's finish that first thing you started, because he was all over the place. He was doing so many things, right? He was starting things, right? He wanted to play all these different sports. He wanted to do this, he wanted to do that. And he would start and he would not finish, right? And then he told me that stuck with him in so many words, right? He said that that's the part of why his grind is so different now, right? I don't know what our original conversation, how our conversation started, but he was talking about his grind and why it's so different now, why he stays focused, why he follows through, why he now follows through. Like, he's been doing it for a while, but the fact that he went back and pulled that saying that I used to say to him, you start things but you don't always finish them, made me proud. But anyway, I just sat there for a moment and I didn't say, oh, I told you so, right? Because I'm not that type of person. But I listened to him, and I thought about it later. Definitely, I thought about it later. Because you never really know what seeds you're planting when you say things like that, right? And I felt proud because my talking to him or fussing with him or nagging him back then didn't fall on deaf ears. So that was really great to me. So, but it also made me think how many of us start things with good intentions but don't follow through. That becomes a pattern for a lot of people. And it's not because we're not capable of finishing it, but because something shifts along the way, right? Sometimes it gets hard, sometimes it gets uncomfortable, or even it wasn't exciting anymore, right? But honest, if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes we just like the idea of something more than the commitment to it, right? If that makes sense. Sometimes we just like to do things new things or challenge ourselves, but we're not invested in the commitment of it all. Okay? And that's a pattern, right? That's the pattern right there. Starting but not finishing. And sometimes it takes a moment like that conversation I was having with my son, or even a conversation with someone else about that very thing that you started but didn't finish. It just sometimes take a moment like that, a conversation, a reminder to make us look at ourselves differently. So ask yourself, what have you started that still deserves your follow through? What have you started that still deserves your follow through? All right. So that was pattern number 3. Okay. Now, pattern number 4, over giving and feeling drained. That resonates with me very well. Now, this one right here, a lot of us don't even realize we're doing it, right? Because you give, you show up, you help, you support. And at the end of all of it, at the end of all of that, you're tired, you're drained, and sometimes you're unappreciated. And then you say to yourself, I don't understand why I feel like this. I don't understand why I feel like this. But the truth is, you can't keep pouring out without checking if you're being refilled. I'm going to repeat that one. You can't keep pouring out without checking if you're being refilled. And sometimes the pattern isn't that people take too much, it's that we give too much without boundaries. We give too much without boundaries. So are you giving from overflow or from obligation? Are you giving from overflow or from obligation? For me, I give from overflow a lot. Well, I was giving from overflow a lot. But now I only give if I'm obligated or if it's not beyond my boundary. So if I'm obligated or if it's not beyond my boundary, I can give. But if it's a boundary I have set and it's not obligated, I do not give any longer. Okay? Now, pattern 5, avoiding hard conversations. Avoiding hard conversations. Let's talk about something we all do at some point, which is what? Avoid. We avoid. We avoid saying how we feel. We avoid addressing issues. We avoid uncomfortable conversations. Why? Because we don't want conflict, we don't want tension, and we don't want to upset anyone or hurt anyone's feelings, right? But what happens when we do that? What happens when we do that? It builds. It builds. And what we avoid in conversation shows up later in frustration. Now we're irritated. Now we're distanced. And now the relationship feels off. Whether it's a love relationship, a friendship, um, a family dynamic, whatever it is, now it feels off, right? And all along, it could have been a conversation, just a simple conversation. So, are you avoiding something that needs to be said? For me, I no longer avoid hard conversations because it is stressful and I become irritated and frustrated, and I can go from 1 to 100 in a second. So, to avoid that, I have to have the conversation. Okay? So, when we look at all of these things, relationships, money, consistency, energy, communication, these aren't just random issues, they're patterns. And the moment you see the pattern, that's the moment you get your power back. That's the moment you get your power back. Because you cannot change what you don't acknowledge. But once you see it, you don't have to keep repeating it. Okay? So let's look at some of these patterns that we're going through. If we can get rid of some of these patterns and do the work necessary to get rid of the patterns, our minds are clearer. And when your mind is clear, peace can enter. Okay? So now that we've talked about patterns, we've called them out, we've looked at them, at least some of them, right? But here's the real question. Why do we stay in those patterns? Why do we stay in them? Why? Because it's not always that we don't see them, right? It's sometimes we see it very clearly, but we stay in them anyway. Why is that? Why is that? Why do we continue to stay into something that we see clearly, right? We see it clearly, but we allow it, right? We stay in it. So let's talk about why that happens. With no judgment, of course, just the truth. Here's one reason: comfort, comfort, comfort. This one right here is real. Sometimes we stay in patterns because they're familiar. Even if they don't feel good, they feel known. You know how it's going to go. You know what to expect. You know the outcome. And as strange as that sounds, that feels safer than the unknown. Because no one likes the unknown, right? We don't trust enough. We don't have the faith. Because stepping into something new means you don't have control yet. Right? So are you choosing what's healthy or what's familiar? Because I can tell you healthy is a lot better. Familiar is safe, but healthy is a whole lot better. Another reason, fear of change. Let's talk about fear. Let's talk about it. Change sounds good until it's time to actually do it, right? Because change requires work. And what is that work? You have to you have to make different choices. So you have to choose differently. Okay? It requires different habits, healthier habits, not those poor habits. And sometimes it requires different people, right? Because some people come into our life for just a season, right? So we have to choose differently. And that can feel uncomfortable, I'm sure. So instead of changing, we stay where we are, even if it's not working. I don't like the sound of that. Okay? But the truth is, growth will always feel unfamiliar I'm sorry, growth will always feel unfamiliar before it feels comfortable, right? You remember in the day the elderly talked about growing pains, right? Growth will always feel unfamiliar before it feels comfortable. So, are you afraid of what will happen if you actually change? Maybe, maybe not. You're thinking about it? Okay. All right, another reason, lack of awareness, right? Lack of awareness. Sometimes we're not even aware it's a pattern. Sometimes we're not even aware it's a pattern, right? We just think this is just how life is. This is just what I go through. We don't step back enough to see it clearly. And that's why sometimes moments like these deserve a conversation because they're important, right? Because awareness is the first interruption of a pattern. Awareness is the first interruption of a pattern. So once you see it and you're aware of it, the likelihood you will probably change it unless you just want to stay familiar and stay comfortable. But if you're willing to grow enough to feel that uncomfortability until it feels comfortable, then you change it, right? So, what have you normalized that actually needs to change? Because that's all it is. We're normalizing behavior, right? We're normalizing that pattern or that poor habit or that behavior because it feels familiar to us instead of coming out of that so that we can feel comfortable. Because, like I said, I would rather be healthy than to stay in familiar territories that does not serve me. So reason number 4, And we hear this a lot. This is just how I am. This is just how I am. That's a mindset. Okay? This is just how I am. This is the one that keeps people stuck the longest. When we hear, or when we say, or we hear others say, that's just how I am. I've always been like this. This is just me. Okay. And listen, just listen, I'm sorry. And listen, yes, we all have traits, habits, and personalities, right? But everything ain't about you. And everything about you isn't permanent. So come out of that. This is just how I am. I've always been like this. This is just me. Really? It's not permanent. It is not permanent. Growth requires us to challenge even the parts of ourselves we've gotten comfortable with. Because if this is just how I am, then nothing ever has to change. And that right there keeps the pattern going. So the pattern never changes. It just keeps going and going and going because this is how I am. No. If it's a poor habit or a bad pattern, let's work on changing it, right? Because I say to you, is it really who you are? Or is it what you've gotten used to? Is it really who you are? Or is it what you've gotten used to? So when you look at it, we stay in patterns because they feel familiar. Change feels uncomfortable. We don't always see it, or we convince ourselves it can't change. Big mistake, right? Because just because something feels familiar doesn't mean it's right for you. Doesn't mean it's right for you. And the moment you start questioning the pattern, the moment you start questioning the pattern, that's the moment you start creating change. Because you don't have to stay stuck in something just because you've been there a long time. Right? Same thing with people staying in jobs that they're not happy with because they're familiar with it and they're scared of change. They want to stay complacent in what they're doing instead of changing that part of you that you don't like. Why are you staying on a job 10, 20, 30 years and you don't like it? Because eventually the fact that you don't like it starts to show in your work. So why do you want to stay in that familiar part of you? Why not change, right? So let's go into breaking the pattern. Breaking the pattern. We've talked about patterns. We've talked about why we stay in them. But now comes the real question. How do we break them? How do we break them? Because awareness is powerful, but awareness alone doesn't change anything. Okay? Awareness is powerful, but awareness alone doesn't change anything. But what does? Action. Action does, right? So let's talk about how we start breaking these patterns. And I'm going to keep it simple, real, and doable. Okay? We want to start by pausing and reflecting. We want to pause and reflect, not react. We want to pause and reflect. Okay? So, first thing, pause. Let's take a pause. I know that sounds simple, but this right here changes everything because most of us react first and reflect later. Something happens when we respond quickly. We fall right into the same habit, the same cycle, in that same pattern. And before we realize it, we've repeated the pattern, right? But what if we just, for a moment, pause before you respond, before you say yes, before you spend any money, before you react emotionally? Just pause and ask yourself, is this the same pattern showing up again? Is this the same pattern showing up again? Right? So think about something in your life that you react quickly instead of pausing first. Right? So we want to pause and reflect on it. If we catch ourselves doing it or we find ourselves doing something familiar, we pause and reflect, not react, but pause and reflect. Then we're going to identify our role. We're going to identify our role. Gently, not harshly, but we're going to identify our role. And this requires honesty, but also grace. Okay? Identify your role. And let me be clear. Let me be clear. This is not about beating yourself up. This is about understanding your part so you can change your part. Because we can't control everything, but we can control what we bring into the situation. Okay? So maybe your role is saying yes when you meant to say no, ignoring red flags, overextending yourself, or avoiding the conversation. Okay? And once you see your role in the situation, that's where your power is, because now you can choose differently. Now you can choose differently. Okay? Now, step 3, do one thing differently next time. And what do I mean by that? Because I love this part of it. because it's very simple and it's very doable. Just do one thing differently. Not everything, not a complete life overhaul, just one thing. If you usually say yes, try saying, let me think about it. Okay? If you usually say yes, try saying, let me think about it. If you usually overspend, pause before you purchase. Pause, reflect, don't react, don't purchase it. Think about it first. Like, do I really need it? Is it a need or is it a want? Is it going to bring value to my wardrobe? Is it going to bring value to my household? So pause before you purchase. And if you're the person who avoids the conversations, those hard conversations, within that conversation, say one honest sentence to make that other person think. Say one honest sentence. And if you overgive, set one boundary. Okay? Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small, intentional shifts. And those small shifts, guess what? They break patterns. They break patterns. Okay? So, what's one thing you can do differently the next time the pattern shows up? Is it setting a boundary, saying one honest sentence, pausing before you purchase, or thinking about it before you answer yes or no? Okay? So when you look at it, breaking patterns isn't about being perfect. It's about being aware, being honest, and being intentional. We should be living our lives intentionally, right? Pause instead of reacting. Own your role and do something different. Okay? And the next time life tries to repeat something, you don't have to respond the same way you used to, because now you have the tools to break the patterns. With an interruption of awareness, and acting on it and doing something different. Okay? You don't have to respond the same way. You're not stuck. You're just one different decision away from change. Remember that. You're just one different decision away from change. Okay? So I struggle with patterns myself. And I feel great because I'm breaking patterns. I'm setting boundaries. I'm pausing before I react. I'm pausing before I purchase. I have the hard conversations. I'm doing the one honest sentence, right? I'm doing all those things, right? So I just wanted to let you know, because I'm not just speaking for what I've seen, I'm speaking from what I've lived, right? And the one pattern I had to face here very recently was overworking, even when my body was telling me to stop, right? I've always been one who shows up, right? I've always been responsible. I've always been dependable. I keep going no matter what, right? And that sounds like a good thing, but there's another side to it, right? Because even when I didn't feel well, even when my body was tired, even when something didn't feel right, I kept going anyway. Job after job, even after my retirement, I carried the same pattern with me. And what I didn't realize at the time was that I wasn't pushing through, I was pushing myself down. And eventually, my body made me sit down. And if I'm honest with myself, that pattern didn't just stay in the work, right? It showed up how I move now with cup of cocoa and chat, feeling like I have to keep going, show up every day, push through no matter what. And recently, like, I have stomach issues, and when my stomach wasn't feeling right, I had to make a choice. Do I keep pushing, or do I listen to my body? Because I know better, right? I know better. I've done this in the past. I've listened to my body. I've stopped pushing through. So why are you continuing this pattern? You've stopped it. Now you have picked it up again. So I had to listen. Do I keep pushing, or do I listen? And that's where the shift started for me again, right? Again, learning to slow down without feeling guilty. Learning to rest is not weakness, right? It's wisdom. And learning that just because I've always done something one way doesn't mean that I can't do it another way, right? And even with my grandson, teaching him about his allowance a few weeks ago, and I talked about that in episode 39, teaching him about allowance and about timing and about structure. I realized something. I'm not just teaching him boundaries, I'm learning them too. So, learning to say, not right now, this is the limit, and this is what works, that applies to life too, right? So I have taken those on, and I'm doing better. Okay. So when we talk about breaking patterns, it's not always loud. Sometimes it looks like resting when you used to push, saying no when you used to say yes, and slowing down when you used to rush. And for me, breaking the pattern means choosing myself in a healthier way. So if your body, your mind, your spirit has been trying to get your attention, like it has done for me many a times, maybe it's not something to ignore. Maybe it's something to listen to. You don't have to earn rest. Remember, you don't have to earn rest. You deserve it. Okay? So take your rest when you need to. Slow down when you need to. Say no when you need to. Like, set those boundaries. Do all the things to break the patterns. Okay? So I want you to sip on this affirmation as we close out. I don't just deal with problems, I grow beyond patterns. Okay? I don't just deal with problems, I grow beyond patterns. All right? All right, so my Coco family, as we close out today's conversation, I want you to sit with this. Awareness is where it starts, but is in what you do next. You don't have to keep repeating cycles that no longer serve you. You don't have to stay stuck in something just because it's familiar. So as you move through your day, your week, pay attention to what shows up. And when it does, choose differently. I have a sip on this quote of the day. I don't just deal with problems, I grow beyond patterns. So that's our affirmation closing out and our quote of the day, okay? Thank you for taking this moment with me here on Cup of Cocoa and Chat. If this conversation if this conversation spoke to you, share it with someone who may need it too. Until next time, take care, stay intentional, and as always, peace, blessings. I love you, and I mean it.